Well, hello, Mr. Fancy Pants.
Hail to the king, bitch.
Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror. Fatal Games by Bruce Richards. Chapter 6. Chip pulled off his denim jacket and arranged it on the floor for a pillow. He lowered Alicia down gently, being especially careful with her head. He knew her brain needed oxygen, and lying her down was the best way to get the blood circulating. He was struck by how peaceful she looked, lying there in the moonlight, as peaceful as a corpse. "What's her problem?" Al asked nonchalantly. "She passed out," Chip said. "All your idiot talk about the murders upset her." Al continued to carve the wooden shutter, his pale blue eyes gleaming over the sheen of the knife blade. "So what should we do with her?" Al asked. The tone of Al's question sent a chill through Chip. He looked down at Alicia. She appeared to be breathing normally. He could barely take his eyes off of her lovely face. Sleeping beauty. If he kissed her, would she wake up? A clicking sound brought Chip back to reality. Al was in the bathroom, flicking the light switch on and off. "I tried it already," Chip said. "There's no electricity." "Mom said the real estate lady was supposed to turn everything on," Al complained, still flicking the light switch. "There's probably a fuse box down in the basement. Why don't you go take a look?" Chip wanted to be alone with Alicia, but Al must have sensed Chip's desire. As usual, Big Brother wasn't going to let Chip get what he wanted. "Why don't you go?" Al suggested with a sneer. "I've got to stay with her," Chip said, nodding toward Alicia, who was beginning to stir. Her eyes flashed open suddenly, filled with terror. Her whole face contorted. For a moment, Chip thought she might even scream, but then she realized where she was, and her fears and her features softened again. "What happened?" Alicia asked in a barely audible voice. "You passed out," Al said casually. "Are you all right?" Chip asked. Alicia nodded and turned and started to sit up. Then she glanced at Al's switchblade stuck in the rotted shutter. The moonlight glinted off the red dragon on the handle of the knife. Chip thought he could see its reflection in her eyes. A red dragon. Something deep in his subconscious was stirred, but he couldn't identify it. The dragon, the red, something. Then, before he could pinpoint a connection, he felt a sudden dead weight against his arm as Alicia fell back into a faint. Chapter 7. Alicia's head was spinning, her thoughts whirling about as if caught up in a tornado. Time became meaningless, and in an instant she remembered everything she had tried so hard to forget. The hit and run, her resultant blindness, the total destruction of Scott's face, and an abrupt end to their relationship. Then there had been Evan, the nerd, the kid everybody loved to hate. But he was the sensitive one who became her total support system. Things had been the worst they could possibly be, until everything else had gone wrong too. Another hit and run killed Tiffany and crippled Boomer. Then Ellen had disappeared. Alicia marveled that she had agreed to readily to the eye surgery offered by Evan's uncle. The man was weirder than Evan, but Alicia had been desperate, and the surgery was convenient. Same day, right next door. The basement turned out to be more than she had bargained for, though. Not exactly sterile. Something apparently had worked, though, because she woke up able to see again. But it was no prize when the first thing she saw was Ellen and Tiffany squished into the boiler, feet first, heads last, eyes gouged out of their sockets. Evan was nearby, hanging from some rusty pipes, a noose around his neck. His eyeballs were out too. The police assumed that Evan had killed himself after desecrating the other bodies. Why not? Weird Evan had been a scapegoat all his life. It seemed like a nice, tidy conclusion. But it wasn't nice and tidy, Alicia knew. Murder seldom was. Fragments of truth stepped forward in Alicia's memory. Dr. Hawk was leaning over her. Only it wasn't Dr. Hawk, it was someone else. Something else. Inhuman. Evil beyond words. Alicia felt a sweeping wave of nausea make its way from her toes up to the top of her head, as the dark, familiar fear gripped her heart and soul with its icy hand. Chapter 8. Chip again supported Alicia by the shoulders and head and lowered her to the floor. "Is this chick for real?" Al asked, making no move to help Chip. "What's with the fainting bit?" Alicia was out for only a moment this time. When her eyes opened again, Chip helped her over to the window seat, hoping some fresh air would help revive her. Alicia was shaking all over. "Where did you get that knife?" she asked Al. "What's it to you?" Al asked, crossing to where the knife was stuck in the chunk of wood. "Just curious." "It's some stupid brotherhood Al's in," Chip said. "All the gang members carry red dragon knives." Al pulled the knife from the board, closed the blade, and stuck it back in his pocket. He returned to the bathroom then and started playing around with the squeaky bathroom faucets. Chip assumed his brother was hanging around just to annoy him. "Why don't you make yourself useful and see if you can find the fuse box?" Chip asked his brother when he came back out. Al ignored Chip. He was standing in front of the stove now. "What is this thing?" he asked Alicia. "It's an old wood-burning stove," she said. "A lot of the old houses around here have them. They come in handy on chilly nights." "What about that thing?" Al asked, kicking an old radiator that was against the side wall. "Doesn't it work?" "Probably, but a wood stove's cozier, I guess," Alicia said with a shrug. "Maybe we should start it up," Chip suggested to Alicia, briskly rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Do you really think it works? It looks like it dates back to the Civil War." He examined it more closely, in what little light was available. It was rusty, with a metal bird attached to a handle that lifted a trapdoor on top. In its talons, the bird, it looked like an eagle or a hawk, clutched a small animal. "I think this was Evan's room," Alicia said. "Evan used to keep a bunch of cats here. I think I can still smell them." "Once the windows are open for a while, that stuff will air out," Chip said. "I hope so for your sake," Al said, "because this is going to be your room." Chip shrugged. "No problem. I guess that leaves the one on the other end of the hallway for you. Mom's taking the big one downstairs." Al walked to the door, flicking his Bic lighter before exiting. "Frickin' Addams family house," he muttered, as he disappeared down the long hallway. The glow from the Bic lighter dimmed and the hall was black again. "Your brother seems a little crazy," Alicia said. She seemed more at ease now that Al was gone. "This place has him spooked. He's really not so tough. Most of his courage is borrowed from his blood brothers." "Who are they?" "The red dragons, like the knife. Brotherhood stuff." Alicia started pacing the room aimlessly. "What's wrong?" Chip asked. "I know a guy who used to carry a knife that looked just like the one your brother has. A switchblade with the red dragon on it." Chip was silent for a moment. "Then I guess you've met one of his brothers," he said simply. "Al says they have members all over the state." Chip couldn't imagine why Alicia was so upset over a gang of juvenile delinquents after what her own neighborhood had been through recently. Chip turned to the pot-bellied stove as Alicia continued to pace. He opened the rusty trapdoor on top and peered inside. "I keep expecting something to jump out of this thing. A skeleton or something," he joked, trying to relieve some of Alicia's tension. But Alicia wasn't so easily distracted. She kept pacing back and forth, like a caged jungle cat, until it seemed she wasn't even aware of her surroundings anymore. He watched her warily, then saw her stumble and rushed over to keep her from falling. The girl was trembling again. "Sorry," Alicia said in a barely audible voice. "I haven't been myself lately." Chip walked her back to the window seat. "Do you want me to take you home?" he asked, hoping she would say no. She could faint all she wanted to, into his arms. "No, it's okay. I think I'll just sit here a minute and try to not think." "And try not to think?" Chip shot her a puzzled look. He made sure she was all right, then went back to the stove. He creaked open the rectangular metal door at the top again and peered in, not quite knowing what he expected to find. Bones, maybe? A partially cremated body, or something equally gruesome? Instead, he saw what looked like pieces of burnt wood. "I think someone used this recently," Chip told Alicia, who was staring out the window. "I can see some wood scraps down in there." "At least I hope it's wood," he thought. Chip spotted a large box of wooden kitchen matches beneath the stubby metal legs of the stove, next to a small stack of old newspapers. He balled up several sections of the newspaper and crammed them into the stove. Then he looked around the room for some other fuel. He spotted the chunk of wood Al had been whittling and retrieved it. Al had carved the shape of a crude dragon. Chip broke up the rotting wood with his foot and stuck the pieces down inside the stove. Then he lit the kindling with one of the kitchen matches. A blaze erupted of such ferocity that it sent Chip staggering backward. Then the entire house shook with a monstrous clank. Chapter 9. "What the hell was that?" Chip asked. The whole house was still trembling. Alicia had instantly leapt from the window seat and rushed to Chip's side. They held on to each other now, waiting for whatever might happen next. Suddenly, steam erupted from the far wall. Alicia began to laugh. "Oh my God! It's just the radiator. Your brother must have turned on the water valve downstairs. It's steam coming up through the pipes." Chip breathed a sigh of relief. "It scared me to death." "Me too," agreed Alicia. More steam clanked up through the old water pipes, making a terrible racket, as the radiator began to hiss with life. Chip noticed that she made no attempt to step out of their embrace. As she looked up to him expectantly, he kissed her gently on the lips. He felt her body relax in his arms. "I guess that did it." Al's voice suddenly filled the room, small but penetrating. Alicia jumped back out of Chip's arms. Silently, Chip cursed his brother. He spun around expecting to see Al's familiar smirk. But Al wasn't there. Where had his brother's voice come from? "Check the lights." Al's voice came again from the corner of the room. Chip walked to that corner and found an air vent. "Did you hear me?" came Al's voice through the vent. "Check the lights." "Gotcha!" Chip shouted back down. Alicia crossed the room to the bedroom light switch. She flicked it up and down, but nothing happened. "Keep trying!" Chip shouted down to his brother. Alicia walked over to the stove to warm herself. Chip joined her there. "I guess you and your brother will be transferring to Springwood High?" Alicia said. Tongues of flame licked up through the open trap door of the stove, making her eyes glow with an eerie brightness. "Yeah," Chip said. "Do you go there?" "Not anymore." "Graduate?" Chip asked, wondering if she was older than he was. "I dropped out." "Oh." Chip was silent for a moment, hoping Alicia would tell him more. He was afraid to push her too much, lest she faint again. "I might still finish. I don't know. I've already got an art scholarship, so I can go to art school when I graduate. Painting used to be about the most important thing in my life. But now, it seems so pointless. Everything does. Why? Chip asked. Alicia's features tightened. It just does, she said flatly. Chip decided to change the subject away from her. Al and I are both seniors. Al's a year older, but he flunked a grade. He thinks he's going to play pro football someday, so classes don't matter. I told him he still has to study if he wants to get into college. The pros don't draft kids out of high school. But Al doesn't listen. He doesn't listen to anyone except Al, and maybe his blood brothers. So I take it your brother's going to play for Springwood? We both are, I hope. Our coach at Middleton arranged tryouts for us. The only problem is that both Al and I want to play quarterback. Al can play defense, too. He was all-conference at Middleton as a free safety, but he says quarterbacks make the top money in the pros. Is Scott Martin still your quarterback? No, Alicia answered in a tiny voice. Chip could barely hear her over the fluttering flames emanating from the stovetop. What happened? Is he injured? The wind began to howl, rattling the window. Yes, Alicia said in a tight voice. I don't think he'll be playing again very soon. Inside the cast-iron pot-bellied stove, the fire crackled and popped. A hiss of steam rumbled up through the radiator. That's too bad. Alicia was staring into the fire, the light dancing off a smattering of light freckles over the bridge of her nose. Chip moved till he was standing behind her and wrapped his arms around her. She turned and raised her face toward his. Chip brushed a strand of Alicia's odd-looking white hair away from her eyes, her lovely, sparkling, vulnerable eyes, and looked deep into them. As he pressed his lips against hers, he saw someone out of the corner of his eye, someone in the hallway staring at him from out of the darkness. Then the room exploded in a burst of white light. Chapter 10. Alicia uttered a cry of dismay. Both she and Chip covered their eyes. I found the fuse box, Al said casually as he stepped into the room. Al felt a brief surge of admiration for Chip. One minute he's about to bash this babe's brains in, the next he's swapping spit with her. I guess those weird stories I heard about Elm Street can't all be true, Al finally said with a smirk. The neighbors around here actually seem to be quite friendly so far. A few minutes later, Al watched from the bedroom window as Chip walked the girl home. He watched them disappear up Elm Street, disappear into the gloom. Gee, I hope I didn't spoil their fun, he chuckled to himself. And then he saw someone run out of the shadows and into his yard, heading for the back. Someone wearing a hooded sweatshirt. Al ran down the stairs and peered out the kitchen window, hoping to get a closer look at the trespasser. If the neighborhood kids thought they were going to use his new home as a funhouse, they were sorely mistaken. He didn't care how many people had been murdered in this house. He was living here now, and anyone who tried to mess around with him would soon learn the hard way that it wasn't a good idea. No one messed with Big Al. Al spotted the figure, opened the kitchen door, and ran out into the backyard. Yo! He yelled to the figure, who took off in a sprint. He ran all the way to the back fence, a rickety wooden white picket fence, and leapt over it. Yo, I'm talking to you! Al yelled again louder. Come back here, you little punk! The hooded figure turned to face Al. The guy looked pretty big, almost as big as Al. The light from the moon glowed off his face, framing it eerily in a silver beam, and Al felt a twitch in his memory. Then the hooded figure disappeared into the murk. That face. He knew that face. It took only a moment for Al to remember where he had seen the boy before. He smiled. He wasn't going to be alone in Springwood after all. He'd found a brother. Wait! Al yelled, running after the hooded figure through a backyard grown wild with tall grass and unruly weeds. Dead wet leaves stuck to his shoes. He hurdled the back fence and ran across a short clearing until he came to the edge of a stretch of woods that suddenly towered in front of him like a big black animal. Up a dark, twisting path that ran through the woods, Al heard footsteps thudding away. Al stared up the path for a long moment. It was so dark, darker than any woods he had ever seen before. Al pulled a flashlight he'd found in the basement from his back pocket and flicked it on. He followed the cone of light through the thick woods, trampling over a path covered with brown leaves and fragrant pine needles. He kept going, and it wasn't long before the path led out of the woods, into a cemetery. Al stopped short and nearly fell on a dewy patch of grass. This was a little more than he had bargained for. Tombstones of different heights rose in not-so-neat rows from the ground like broken, rotting teeth. There was no sign of the hooded figure. The full moon floated in front of him as if leading the way. He thought of turning back, but decided to push on. He wouldn't do this for just anyone, only for a brother. There were certain allegiances you had to honor, and the Brotherhood was one of them, or else you were alone. All alone. And Al had felt so alone all his life. The warmth and the attention and the love had all gone to Chip. Al walked past the half-open rusty gate that said Elm Street Cemetery, up the gently sloping hill, looking for his brother, and found him. The dark hooded figure stood before a gravestone silhouetted by a giant golden moon. Loose leaves swirled about his feet as a sudden rush of wind whistled through the cemetery. Al silently approached the hooded figure. The enigmatic form was running his hand along the cool granite of a newly set gravestone. Al peered past the hooded figure, curious to see the name on the tombstone. Ellen Sawyer. "Brother," Al started to say, but a gust of wind blew the word back into his face. The wind whipped up, suddenly fierce, causing dirt from the grave to blow in his direction. Al raised his hand to shield himself. Then the hooded figure turned slowly and looked at Al with eyes that burned bright red and as bright and as hot as the breath of a dragon. Chapter 11. Chip dragged his futon up the stairs, down the dusty hallway, and into his new bedroom. He flopped it onto the floor next to the cast-iron stove. It seemed like a cozy place to crash. The stove still gave off heat, though the fire had long since gone out. Chip peered in at the orange coals still glowing brightly. Then he shut the trap door on top of the stove, lay down on the futon, and closed his eyes. He was totally worn out from unloading the van. Al had disappeared again. He hadn't been at the house when Chip returned from walking Alicia home, so Chip had unloaded most of the stuff from the van himself. At first, he was just pissed that Al had left all the work for him. After an hour had passed, though, it crossed his mind that maybe he should be worried. He didn't let the worry consume him. It was entirely possible that Al was hiding someplace to avoid having to help. Chip closed his eyes and felt a cool breeze wash over him as he lay on the futon. He opened his eyes and realized he had left his bedroom door open, but he was too tired to get up and close it. Might as well leave it open anyway in case Maggie wanted to get in. Where had that crazy cat gone anyway? Probably someplace in the house exploring. Chip closed his eyes again and thought of Alicia. What a babe, and what a kisser. He couldn't believe how lucky he was to meet such a gorgeous girl, his first night in Springwood, and under such unusual circumstances. Life is so strange, Chip thought, as his eyelids grew heavy, and he drifted off into sleep. The metal trapdoor on top of the stove popped open with a loud clunk. Chip opened his eyes. He smelled something foul. An eerie red mist snaked out through the opening of the stove. Like a rope, it coiled around an exposed beam in the ceiling. At the end of the rope hung a noose, and the noose was looped around the neck of a teenage boy. His neck was twisted at an impossible angle. Long, slender fingers dangling lifelessly at his side like useless meat hooks. Behind his thick, lensed black-framed glasses were empty eye sockets. The smoke ghost drifted across the floor and hovered in one corner of the room, pointing a bony red smoke finger first at Chip, then down at the floor. Flames from his fingertips hitting the floor like blowtorches of amazing accuracy. Chip recognized the form now. It was Evan Walker. He wants me to go into the basement, he thought with horror, where the murders took place. But Chip couldn't move, no matter what. Every muscle in his body was petrified. Then the hideous creature began his approach. Chapter 12. Ha! Chip bolted upright in his bed, his heart thundering inside his chest. Who screamed? Breathless, he gasped for air, his mind whirling with horror-filled thoughts. He had heard it even in his dream, like the screech of a dying cat. The thing in the stove, red, ghostly monster, no eyeballs, hands like meat hooks, incongruous glasses, fingers like fire daggers pointing, awful screams, and screams again. Who had screamed? He glanced at the wood-burning stove, still glowing warm and friendly, and then he knew. He had screamed. It was a nightmare. Another nightmare. This one about a gross, eyeless dude wearing his big, nerdy glasses. Dazed, Chip rose from the futon and stood in front of the stove. With a trembling hand, he lifted the top trapdoor and peered inside. Nothing. No ghost. No demons. No hideous red smoky monster faces with empty eye sockets. Just warm, glowing embers, almost out now, though the stove seemed to radiate more heat than before. Chip's body was soaked in sweat. Hot, nervous sweat. Over a stupid nightmare. Chip looked at the glowing numbers of his digital clock plugged in at the far wall. Almost 4 a.m. The first bad dream had come just a little past midnight. Now another one 4 hours later. At this rate, he would be dead from fright before the weekend was over. His first night on Elm Street. The floorboard creaked in the dark hallway right outside the bedroom door. Chip swiveled his head and saw the black silhouette of a hooded figure standing in the gloom, staring at him. Chip fought to remain calm. I know it's you, Al, so you can come out. Either come out or close the door. You're letting all the heat out. Soft laughter. Then Al walked into the room. Another bad dream, bro? Al asked. Bummer. Al's face took on the familiar smirk. Chip felt the urge to rip that smirk off and shove it down into the stove once and for all. He wanted to burn it to ashes, take Al's entire head, maybe, smirk and all, and rub it into the hot coals glowing inside the stove's belly until Al screamed for mercy, and then he would rub even harder. Al played with the strings of his hood. If you think maybe you could go the rest of the night without screaming the roof off the house, I might be able to get some sleep. Or should I sit by your bed and hold your hand to keep the boogeyman away? You want the lights on? Al started flicking the bedroom lights on and off. Finally, Al got tired of his own game and left. The room seemed colder now. Chip got up and walked over to the stove to see if he could poke some more life out of the fire. But it wasn't necessary. Somehow the fire had rekindled itself, and the flames were dancing high and lively. Chapter 13. Saturday afternoon. Chip slept until noon, when the sunlight that had been working its way across the room finally hit him full in the face. He yawned and sat on the edge of his futon, still groggy from interrupted sleep. His eyes felt puffy, his mind fuzzy, his head wooden. But at least he had made it through the night without a third nightmare. His stomach grumbled hungrily. He hoped there was something in the fridge to eat. Maybe his mom had stopped at the 7-Eleven on the way home for some groceries. Chip chuckled to himself. Did they even have a fridge? He couldn't remember if the previous tenant was supposed to leave one behind. He stood up, crossed to the window, and looked out. It was a bright, sunny day, but the grass looked wet and there were puddles in the street. He must have slept through a storm. Chip pulled some gray sweats on out of his duffel bag and got dressed. Maybe later he'd get out and throw the ball around with Al. As he laced up his Nikes, he noticed how dingy and bare his bedroom walls looked. The floor was greasy, and the room still smelled of cat. Maggie? Where had Maggie run off to? He hadn't seen her since last night. Chip tacked his football posters up on the wall. His favorite was a life-size shot of Bernie Kosar, when Kosar was with the Cleveland Browns. He stood back to admire it. Kosar was a great quarterback, Chip thought, that he actually looked a little bit like him. Chip noticed a thin diagonal crack along the wall and moved the poster over to cover it. Perfect. Suddenly he slapped his forehead with the palm of his hand. Alicia! Last night when he had walked her home, she had said she would come over today to help with the cleaning. Had she been over already? Of course. She did live practically next door. He could go over to her house if he'd missed her. Out of curiosity, Chip ran down the stairs and out onto the front porch. There was no doorbell, just an old-fashioned knocker on the door in the shape of a beady-eyed hawk, identical to the bird on the handle of the cast-iron stove. Chip knocked lightly on his mother's bedroom door. No answer. Maybe she had gone to work already. He glanced out the kitchen window to see if her station wagon was still in the driveway. Nope. Just Al's van. Chip climbed back up the stairs. As he passed Al's bedroom, he heard a long, low moan. Chip placed his ear against the door to hear better. The moaning grew louder. He knocked on Al's door. Al? No answer. Then a loud gasp of pain. Al! Chip twisted the doorknob with a sweaty palm and swung the door open. Al was sprawled out on top of the bed, half covered by just a sheet. His body was wet with perspiration. His face was beet red and filled with terror. No! Al bellowed in his sleep. He can't be. It was all a joke. I was only joking. No! His features contorted into a gruesome mask of revulsion. And then Al suddenly rose from the bed and came at Chip, like a lunatic caught in a trance. Before Chip knew what was happening, Al had his meaty hands around his neck. Chip tried to pry his brother's hold loose as he realized he couldn't get any air. He slapped his brother in the face as hard as he could, but Al's grip only tightened. Ow! Ow! Chip croaked hoarsely as Al's steel-like fingers bit into the skin of his throat. Al was strangling him to death. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13 of Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror Fatal Games. I'm actually enjoying this one so far, curious to see where it goes. We spent a lot of the beginning of this book, we're about 1/3 of the way through the book, I believe, in the house, like on the day they're moving in. I'm curious to see what's up with the hooded figure. I have a feeling now that Al's probably going to be the one that's possessed because we didn't really know what happened at the cemetery. But great creepiness. I'm just curious to see who Freddy is possessing. I'm guessing Al. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. I'll be back very soon with more of Freddy Krueger's Tales of Terror Fatal Games by Bruce Richards. I usually, for this book, was doing Patreon preview where it was on Patreon for a week before I dropped it on YouTube. But since I've been gone for a month now with a wisdom tooth problem, and you guys have had to wait, I'm dropping it all at the same time. But if you would like to support the channel, please go to the Patreon page. The link is in the description. And you can help support the channel to keep it going and growing for years to come. Be excellent to each other, and I'll see you soon.